So, in the early 20th century, the uh, Great Depression certainly uh, was a difficult time, uh, and I urge any of you who have access to anybody who has memories of that period to talk to them. Uh, some of the stories are pretty moving. I think it actually still has an impact. Um, if you've ever seen my basement, I hold on to stuff. I was brought up by kids who grew up in the Depression, and they were by no means as bad as my grandparents, who I ended up cleaning out their houses, and they were hoarders even compared to me. I'm trying to do better. Yeah, I'm certainly trying, that's for sure. But anyway, by that time, uh, electricity was very common in New Hampshire. New Hampshire was certainly ahead of the curve on electrifying, uh, and well ahead other areas of the country. Another one that's interesting is radio. Um, WLNH in Laconia started operations in 1922, which is only a year after KDKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is regarded as the first real commercial radio station in that period. Um, Newspapers, New Hampshire had 16 daily newspapers, 21 weekly newspapers, and a total of 54. I'm not sure what the other 20 some odd are, but I wanted to mention that before the mathematicians in the crowd got on my case. So, but anyway, the Great Depression, very difficult, and besides, the economic impact, there was turmoil. One of the guys who dealt with that effectively was a governor of the period. His name was John G. Winant. Governor Winant was governor from 1925 to 1927 and 1931 to 1935. He was a teacher at St. Paul's. He was in World War I. He'd been an aviator and was known for taking on hazardous missions rather than sending the people he commanded. He was in office when the Great Depression hit, and he was responsible for New Hampshire's response to the Depression, which included an Emergency Credit Act, which allowed towns and cities to keep essential services, I'm talking like fire and police, in place. A minimum wage that included women and children, so that men who were the breadwinners at the time weren't cut out of the labor market. There were highway improvement projects, a stimulus package that also was setting the stage for the prosperity to come. Even a state banking commission to prevent some of the things that had led to the Depression. Winant was very popular, highly regarded. He was a Republican, but Franklin Roosevelt, of all people, appointed him to be the first administrator of the Social Security Administration in 1935. He was also involved in the International Labor Office until 1939. And later he was appointed to Great Britain as an ambassador in the period from 1941 to 1946. Became a great friend of Winston Churchill and an even closer friend of Sarah Churchill. Guys, if you Google Sarah Churchill, you'll be sympathetic anyway. He was very effective in British-American relations. and helped keep that alliance working smoothly, or as smoothly as it did. Winant came back after the war, wrote his memoirs, and the day they were delivered, he committed suicide. The whole thing had taken a lot out of him, and but he continues to be highly regarded. There was a recent bipartisan effort to create a memorial for him near the State House. If you'll see it, it's across from the State House. It's not soaring, it's not majestic, it's pretty down to earth, like Winant was. Winant during the Depression would go around, he'd find the homeless, give them $50. Now you say, okay, this was his own money, by the way, not somebody else's. He was, and you say $50, hey, big spender. At the time, that $50 could get somebody a meal, get them a room, they could get cleaned up, and maybe become more employable. So the guy was very practical, very well liked, highly regarded. So aside from the Depression, Mother Nature handed New Hampshire a couple of whammies during the 30s, including the floods of 1936. Basically resulted in a huge amount of property damage. Basically what happened was there was a very heavy winter, and we had one of those springs where there were just weeks of solid rain, and banks overflowed. This impact was felt not only in New Hampshire but throughout New England. What it led to was the founding or the passage of the Flood Control Act of 1936 on the federal level, and resulted in the construction of three dams: the Blackwater Dam, the Franklin Falls Dam, and the Hopkinton or Everett Dam in New Hampshire, and those have been pretty effective in reducing the amount of damage here and downstream. One of the things is that approximately 11,000 acres has to be devoted to a floodplain. Stop the water, it's got to go somewhere. But that area is open for recreational use. There are a lot of hiking trails and all of that, all with warnings: if you hear running water, get out fast. Interestingly, the loss of tax revenue to towns is subject to an agreement that was arrived at in the 50s, where the Commonwealth of Massachusetts pays 70% and New Hampshire 30% of the lost revenue. One of the things that led to, and I hope I have pictures somewhere for you, Hill Village, and Hill was old established town, founded in 1753. In 1937, they got greetings from the government saying, "Hi, we're turning your town into a floodplain." Some of the folks took the money because they were bought out, and left. But some of the townspeople thought, "Wait a minute, we can do better," and basically moved the town to higher ground by 1940, and 14 houses were moved, cemetery, schools were reconstructed, so it isn't where it is. But if you're on 3A going between Franklin and Bristol. You can turn off on Old Town Road, and actually the area is open for recreational use most of the time. It's a pretty nice area. There was also the hurricane of 1938. 19 and this is the standard by which a lot of people think of hurricanes. It was particularly destructive. It was an odd series of events, but it resulted in winds up to 115 miles an hour. On Mount Washington, it got up to 163, but they're always showing off. Anyway, the damage, there were 600 people dead in New England. 4,500 houses destroyed, 25,000 damaged, 26,000 automobiles were immersed, and roughly 2 billion trees went down in New England and New York, basically 35% of New England forest. That amounted to 2.7 billion board feet of lumber, and about half that was salvaged. Devastating event. It led to great improvements in forecasting and communication. And an odd note, this was in the Depression. It was at the late stage of the Depression where there was a sharp recession. It provided work for a lot of people. A friend of my dad's, had been a little on the desperate side looking for work, and he was, he got a job cleaning up. So I guess there's a silver lining to everything. I would mention that the Weeks Act in 1918 established the White Mountain National Forest, and I think we talked about that in a prior thing. The work on the flood control was kind of an extension of that. World War II, the United States was involved, so New Hampshire had to get into it. And I note the contribution of the Portsmouth Navy Yard, building something like 70 fleet submarines. One of the things, and this will be a shock, particularly to those of you who've dealt with the federal government, was that the work came through, with high quality, ahead of schedule, and under budget. Wrap your brain around that one, folks. Okay. There were a number of ways World War II touched New Hampshire. There were certainly changes brought about socially. There was an influx of people into the greater Portsmouth area that became more vibrant. One of the stories that you may want to follow up on was a prisoner of war camp in Stark, New Hampshire. Stark is way up there. I'm not going to grab the map. And it's up there on Route 10, what's left of it. And you'll find a marker. And German prisoners of war were put to work cutting pulpwood. Of course, we needed paper with which to fight the war. No direct military action in New Hampshire. Some involvement, and if you'd taken the live class, you would have heard more about it. So, once again, in under 15 minutes, and we'll look for you next week. We'll talk about I'll talk about the post-war changes in New Hampshire.